Hey dreamers, tonight we journey into the golden sands of ancient Egypt, into a time when the boundary between life and death was not an ending but a doorway, and standing at that threshold was a god with the head of a black jackal and the wisdom of eternity. His name was Anubis, and his story weaves through every pyramid, every tomb, and every beating heart that ever hoped for something beyond the darkness. But what if the loyal assistant we all know was once the supreme king of the underworld himself? Why did Anubis, the original lord of the dead, step aside for another god? And what does this forgotten power struggle reveal about the very nature of justice in ancient Egypt? Before you settle in, take a moment to like the video if these journeys bring you a little closer to rest. It's always a pleasure to see our community of listeners, so let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Let us begin at the very beginning, in an age before the Great Pyramids rose from the desert floor, when Egypt was still finding its voice, and the gods themselves were taking shape from the dreams and fears of humanity. In these ancient days, the people who lived along the fertile banks of the Nile observed the world around them with careful, knowing eyes. They watched the sun rise and set, the river flood and recede, and they watched, too, the wild jackals that prowled the edges of their cemeteries in the cool hours before dawn. These creatures, sleek and black-furred with ears that seemed always alert, moved through the burial grounds like shadows given form. They were scavengers by nature, drawn to the scent of death, and the Egyptians feared that the jackals might disturb the resting places of their beloved dead. But rather than simply driving the animals away, the ancient people did something far more profound. They transformed their fear into reverence. If the jackal haunted the realm of the dead, they reasoned, then perhaps the jackal could also protect it. And so, from the desert twilight, and the nervous prayers of the living, the god Anubis was born. In the earliest representations, carved into stone during the reign of the first pharaohs, Anubis appears fully as a jackal, his form recumbent and watchful, his body the colour of the deepest night. Later, as Egyptian art grew more sophisticated, he took on a hybrid shape, the body of a man, strong and upright, crowned with the head of a jackal whose ears stood eternally erect. His skin was painted black, not as a symbol of decay, but as an emblem of rebirth, for black was the colour of the rich, fertile soil left behind by the Nile's annual flood, the soil that brought life back to the land year after year. In Anubis, death and life were not opposites. They were partners in an endless dance. The ancient Egyptians called him by many names. In their own language, he was Inpu or Anpu, though the Greeks who later walked the streets of Alexandria would call him Anubis, and that is the name by which most of the world knows him today. His titles were numerous, and each one spoke to a different aspect of his sacred role. He was he who is in the place of embalming, the divine patron of those who prepared the dead for eternity. He was foremost of the Westerners, a reference to the Western Desert where the sun set each evening, and where the necropolises, the cities of the dead, were built. He was the lord of the sacred land, and the guardian of the scales. Each title was a promise, a reassurance whispered into the darkness, that the dead would not be abandoned, that someone watched over them, that the journey beyond life was not made alone. But one of these titles, foremost of the Westerners, is a relic of a forgotten age, a quiet clue to a time when Anubis was not the loyal son, but the supreme king of the underworld. To understand how a king became a prince, we must first understand the divine family he was born into. But Anubis, like all the great gods of Egypt, did not exist in isolation. He was part of a vast and intricate family, a divine lineage that stretched back to the very creation of the world. And the story of his birth, like so many myths, is a tale wrapped in secrecy, passion, and the complicated relationships of immortal beings who felt jealousy, love, and longing just as mortals did. The tale most commonly told begins with the god Osiris, who was the great king of Egypt, the bringer of civilization, the teacher of agriculture and law. Osiris ruled over a golden age, and beside him stood his wife and sister, the goddess Isis, whose magic was unmatched and whose love for Osiris was as deep as the Nile itself. But Osiris had a brother, Set, the god of storms and chaos, whose heart burned with envy. Set was married to Nephthys, the fourth sibling in this divine quartet, a goddess of morning and twilight, often overshadowed by her more famous sister. Nephthys, it was said, longed for what Isis had. not just power, but the love of Osiris and the possibility of bearing a child. One night, according to the story recorded by the Greek historian Plutarch, Nephthys disguised herself as Isis. Whether through magic or simply the dim light of evening, Osiris did not recognize the deception, and from this single encounter, a child was conceived. When Nephthys realized she was carrying Osiris's son, fear gripped her heart. She knew that if Set discovered the truth, his rage would be terrible. So when the baby was born, Nephthys made a heartbreaking choice. She abandoned the infant in the wilderness, hoping that distance and secrecy might save him from Set's wrath. But the child did not perish alone in the desert. Isis, who possessed not only great magic but also great compassion, learned of the infant's existence. Some say she was guided by a pack of dogs whose barking led her to the hidden place where the baby lay. Others say her own divine intuition revealed the truth. Whatever the means, Isis found the child, and though he was born of her husband's union with another, she did not turn away. Instead, she lifted the baby into her arms, named him Anubis, and raised him as her own. In this act of mercy, Isis gave Anubis not only life but also purpose, for he grew up in the shadow of the goddess of magic and learned from her the sacred mysteries of death and resurrection. Anubis grew into a god of immense wisdom and quiet strength. He did not crave the spotlight as some gods did. His work was done in the shadows, in the cool silence of the embalming tent and the solemn halls where the dead were judged. And it was in one of the most pivotal moments in all of Egyptian mythology that Anubis would prove his worth and define his eternal role. The event that changed everything was the murder of Osiris. Set, consumed by envy and rage, devised a plan to destroy his brother. In some versions of the tale, Set tricked Osiris into lying inside a beautifully crafted chest, which he then sealed and cast into the Nile. In others, Set's violence was more direct, and he dismembered Osiris's body, scattering the pieces across the length and breadth of Egypt. The details vary, but the outcome was always the same. Osiris, the great king, was dead, and the world fell into shadow. Isis, devastated by grief, set out to recover her husband's body. She travelled the length of the Nile, searching tirelessly, and eventually, with the help of her sister Nephthys, she found all the scattered pieces of Osiris. But finding the body was only the beginning. The real challenge was what came next: how to restore Osiris, how to give him the dignity and preservation he needed to continue his existence, even if it could no longer be in the world of the living. It was here that Anubis stepped forward. Using knowledge that seemed to come from the very fabric of the universe, Anubis carefully reassembled the body of Osiris. He washed the limbs, anointed them with precious oils, and wrapped them in linen bandages infused with spells and prayers. He removed the internal organs and placed them in sacred jars, preserving them for eternity. This was the first mummification, the prototype for a practice that would define Egyptian civilization for thousands of years. Through Anubis's skill, Osiris was transformed, not brought back to life in the way he had lived before, but preserved, dignified, and made ready for a new role as the ruler of the underworld, the judge of the dead. This moment is central to understanding Anubis. He did not fight battles with flashing swords or summon storms to destroy his enemies. His power was quieter, more intimate. He was the god who tended to the body when it was most vulnerable, who ensured that the dead were not simply cast aside, but were prepared with love and ritual for the journey ahead. Priests who performed mummifications in ancient Egypt did not see themselves merely as technicians. They saw themselves as embodying Anubis himself. They wore masks shaped like jackal-heads, transforming into the god as they worked, their hands guided by his ancient wisdom. The mummification process, which Anubis perfected and which the Egyptians practiced for millennia, was an elaborate and sacred procedure. It began with the washing of the body, a purification in water drawn from the Nile, the river that was itself a source of life and renewal. Then came the removal of the internal organs, except for the heart, which the Egyptians believed was the seat of thought, memory, and emotion. The heart would be needed later, for it would be weighed in the scales of judgment. The brain, oddly enough, was discarded, extracted through the nostrils with a long, hooked instrument, an oversight by modern standards, but the Egyptians placed their faith in the heart, not the mind. After the organs were removed and stored in canopic jars, each protected by a different deity, the body was packed in natron, a naturally occurring salt that drew out all moisture, drying the flesh and preventing decay. This process took 40 days, a period of stillness and waiting. Once the body was thoroughly dried, it was cleaned again, rubbed with oils and resins, and then wrapped, layer upon layer, in linen strips. Between the layers, amulets were placed, small charms inscribed with spells, images of protective gods, and symbols of life and power. The entire process could take 70 days, and at the end, what emerged was not a corpse, but a mummy, a body preserved for eternity, ready to house the soul should it need to return. But Anubis's role did not end with the completion of the mummification. On the day of the funeral, as the body was carried in procession to the tomb, Anubis was there in spirit and often in symbol. A priest wearing the jackal mask would walk beside the mummy, and at the entrance to the tomb, a critical ritual would be performed, the opening of the mouth ceremony. This ritual was believed to restore to the deceased all their senses, the ability to see, hear, speak, breathe, and eat. Without it, the spirit would be trapped in darkness, unable to navigate the challenges of the afterlife. Using special instruments, including an adze and a ceremonial knife, the priest, in the guise of Anubis, would touch the mouth, eyes, ears, and nose of the mummy, reciting spells that awakened each sense. It was a moment of profound transformation, a symbolic rebirth, and it was Anubis who presided over this delicate threshold. And now, before we continue deeper into the mysteries of the afterlife, let me ask you, what ritual or tradition in your own life brings you comfort in times of uncertainty? For me, it has to be the simple act of lighting a candle in the evening. There's something grounding about that small flame, a reminder that even in darkness there's warmth. Anubis understood this too, in his own way, the comfort of ritual, of doing things properly, of honouring what has passed while preparing for what comes next. With the body mummified, the senses restored, and the funeral complete, the real journey began. The ancient Egyptians believed that death was not an ending but a transition into a realm called the Duat, the underworld. This was not a place of eternal torment as some later cultures imagined hell to be. Instead, it was a vast, complex, and often perilous landscape filled with rivers of fire, gates guarded by demons, serpents coiled in the darkness, and caverns where time moved differently. To navigate the Duat, the deceased needed guidance, protection, and knowledge, and it was Anubis who provided all three. The soul, freed from the body, would begin its journey through the Duat accompanied by Anubis. He was the psychopomp, the guide of souls, leading the dead through each stage of the underworld. The journey was neither quick nor easy. There were challenges to overcome, riddles to answer, and beings to appease. The deceased would need to know the names of the guardians at each gate, the passwords that allowed passage, and the spells that turned away danger. This knowledge was recorded in texts like the Book of the Dead, a collection of spells, prayers, and instructions that were often inscribed on tomb walls or written on papyrus scrolls and placed beside the mummy. These texts were not intended to be read in life. They were guidebooks for the afterlife, and every traveller through the Duat carried them like a map and a shield. Anubis, patient and vigilant, walked beside the soul through every trial. He did not abandon those in his care. In the darkness of the underworld, his black form was a constant, a reassurance that no one journeyed alone. And at last, after what might have felt like an eternity of wandering, the soul would arrive at the most important place in all the Duat, the Hall of Truth, also called the Hall of Two Truths, where the final judgment awaited. This hall was a vast chamber, its walls adorned with images of gods and symbols of cosmic order. At the center of the room stood a massive set of golden scales, and seated upon a throne was Osiris, now the king of the dead, his skin green like the fertile earth, his body wrapped in the linen of a mummy, his hands holding the crook and flail, symbols of kingship and authority. Beside him stood Isis and Nephthys, and nearby was Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom and writing, ready to record the outcome of the judgment. And there too was Anubis, standing by the scales, ready to perform the most sacred of his duties. The soul, trembling with a mixture of hope and fear, would first recite the negative confessions. These were not confessions of sins committed, but rather declarations of sins not committed. A litany of 42 statements addressed to 42 divine judges, each one presiding over a specific transgression. The deceased would say, "I have not killed, I have not stolen, I have not lied, I have not caused anyone to weep, I have not been angry without cause." The list went on, covering every aspect of moral behavior, from grand crimes to small cruelties. It was, in a way, a final accounting of a life lived, a chance to stand before the universe and declare one's integrity. If the negative confessions were accepted, the ceremony moved to its climax, the weighing of the heart. Anubis, with great care, would remove the deceased's heart and place it on one side of the golden scales. On the other side, he would place a single white feather, the feather of Ma'at, the goddess who embodied truth, justice, and cosmic order. The entire hall would fall silent. The outcome of this moment would determine everything. If the heart, heavy with lies, cruelty, or wrongdoing, weighed more than the feather, it would tip the scales, and the consequence was swift and terrible. A creature known as Ammit, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, crouched nearby, waiting. She was the devourer, and if the heart was judged unworthy, she would consume it, and the soul would cease to exist, swallowed into oblivion. The Egyptians called this the second death, and it was the worst fate imaginable, far worse than any physical death, for it meant total annihilation, the erasure of the self from existence. But if the heart was light, if it balanced perfectly against the feather, then the deceased had passed the test. Anubis would turn to Osiris and announce the verdict, and Thoth would record it in his scrolls for all eternity. The soul was declared justified or true of voice, and the gates to the field of reeds would open. The field of reeds, known in Egyptian as Aru or Sekhet Aru, was paradise. Imagine, if you will, an endless expanse of golden fields, swaying with grain beneath a sky of perfect, cloudless blue. The air is warm but not oppressive, and a gentle breeze carries the scent of water and growing things. The Nile flows through this land, clear and abundant, its banks lined with date palms and papyrus. There is no sickness here, no sorrow, no hunger or thirst. The dead who enter this place are reunited with loved ones who passed before them. They can farm the land if they wish, or simply rest in the shade. There is laughter, music, and peace. Time moves differently here, or perhaps it doesn't move at all. It is a place of eternal contentment, a mirror of the best of earthly life, without any of its pain. And it was Anubis who made this possible. Without his guidance, the soul would have been lost in the Duat. Without his careful weighing of the heart, there would be no justice, no assurance that the virtuous were rewarded. He was not a god of fear, despite his association with death. He was a god of fairness, of protection, of seeing people safely through the most vulnerable transition they would ever face. It's worth considering, I think, how different this is from some other cultural views of death. The Egyptians did not see the afterlife as a distant, unknowable mystery, but as something real, structured, and navigable. They believed in preparation, in doing things right, in following the rituals that had been passed down for generations. There's something almost comforting in that, a belief that if you live well and prepare properly, you can face the unknown with confidence. Anubis embodied that confidence. He was the proof that the system worked, that there was someone on the other side waiting to help. Throughout the long history of ancient Egypt, spanning more than 3,000 years, the role and worship of Anubis evolved. In the very earliest times, during the Old Kingdom, Anubis was the preeminent god of the dead, the one to whom all prayers for the deceased were addressed. He was the king of the underworld before Osiris rose to that position. But as the centuries passed and the cult of Osiris grew in power and popularity, Anubis's role shifted. He did not disappear or diminish. Instead, he found a new place within the mythology, becoming the son of Osiris and Nephthys in the most popular version of the story, and taking on the role of assistant and embalmer. It was a demotion in some ways, but also a specialization. Anubis became the expert, the master of the technical and ritual aspects of death, while Osiris handled the judgment and kingship. But the people of Egypt never stopped revering Anubis. His image appeared in tombs across the land, carved into stone, painted on walls, and molded into amulets. These amulets, small figures of a jackal or a jackal-headed man, were placed in tombs to invoke Anubis's protection. Some were worn by the living, particularly those who worked in professions related to death embalmers, priests, and undertakers. The presence of Anubis was a ward against desecration, a promise that the dead would not be disturbed by thieves or scavengers, that their journey would be safeguarded. Anubis's primary cult center was a city the Greeks called Cynopolis, which simply means city of the dog, though its original Egyptian name was more complex. Here, Anubis was the chief deity, honored in festivals and rituals. Dogs and jackals were considered sacred in this city, and to harm one was considered a grave offense. The people of Cynopolis saw themselves as under Anubis's direct protection, and they took that responsibility seriously. But Anubis's influence extended far beyond a single city. He was worshipped throughout Egypt, in every necropolis, in every embalming tent, and at every funeral. His presence was invoked whenever someone died, regardless of their status. Kings and commoners alike needed Anubis, for death is the one experience that unites all human beings, regardless of wealth, power, or position. In that sense, Anubis was the most democratic of gods. He judged all hearts with the same fairness, and he guided all souls with the same care. And here's a question for you. If you could ask one question of someone who has passed on, what would it be? For me, it has to be asking my grandmother what she thought about the world as it changed around her in her later years. I think about how much the world shifts and how we carry our pasts with us. Anubis carried the past of every soul he guided, holding their stories as he led them forward. As Egypt entered the later periods of its history, the world around it changed dramatically. The Greeks arrived, led by Alexander the Great, and after his death, Egypt was ruled by the Ptolemaic dynasty, a line of Greek pharaohs. Greek culture and Egyptian culture began to blend in fascinating and sometimes strange ways. The Greeks, with their own rich mythology and their own gods of death, Hades, lord of the underworld, and Hermes, the swift messenger who guided souls, looked at Anubis and saw a familiar role. Hermes, like Anubis, was a psychopomp, a guide of the dead. And so, in a gesture that reflected the merging of these two great civilizations, a new deity was born, Hermanubis, a fusion of Hermes and Anubis. Hermanubis was depicted in art as a figure with the jackal head of Anubis and the clothing and symbols of Hermes, a caduceus, the winged staff, and sometimes a petasos, the wide-brimmed traveller's hat. This syncretic god was worshipped particularly in places like Alexandria, where Greek and Egyptian populations lived side by side. Temples to Hermanubis appeared, and rituals honoring both traditions were performed. It's a reminder that religion is not static. It shifts and adapts as cultures meet and influence each other. Anubis, ever adaptable, found a place in this new world just as he had in the old. Even the Romans, who came after the Greeks and eventually absorbed Egypt into their empire, recognized the power and appeal of Anubis. Worship of Anubis spread beyond Egypt's borders, carried by traders, soldiers, and devotees of the goddess Isis, whose cult became immensely popular throughout the Roman world. Wherever Isis was honored, Anubis often followed, appearing in frescoes, statues, and household shrines as far away as Pompeii and Rome itself. The Roman world, with its own complex relationship with death and the afterlife, found something compelling in the figure of the jackal-headed god who promised that death was not the end and that justice awaited in the beyond. But even as the worship of the Egyptian gods spread, the old world was fading. Christianity began to rise, bringing with it a new set of beliefs about death, judgment, and the afterlife. The old temples were closed, the rituals banned, and the gods slowly retreated into memory and myth. The last hieroglyphic inscription was carved in 394 CE, and with it, the knowledge of how to read the ancient language was lost. The temples of Anubis fell silent. The embalming tents closed. The jackal no longer walked beside the dead through the hall of truth. And yet, Anubis did not vanish. His image endured in the art and artifacts that survived, buried in tombs and preserved by the dry desert air. When archaeologists and explorers began to rediscover Egypt in the 18th and 19th centuries, unearthing temples and translating texts, Anubis emerged once more into the light of human awareness. He became a symbol, instantly recognizable, an icon of ancient Egypt's profound relationship with death. Today, Anubis appears in museums, in books, in films and video games, often misunderstood as a sinister or frightening figure. But those who study him more closely, who read the ancient texts and examine the rituals, come to understand the truth. Anubis was never a god of fear. He was a god of care. Think about the qualities that Anubis embodies. He is patient, never rushing the process of mummification, taking the time to do things properly. He is fair, weighing each heart with precision and without bias. He is loyal, never abandoning a soul in the darkness of the Duat. He is protective, standing guard over the dead to ensure they are not disturbed. These are not the qualities of a monster or a demon. These are the qualities of a guardian, a guide, and, in a way, a friend. To the ancient Egyptians, Anubis was someone they could trust at the moment when trust mattered most, when they faced the unknown. It's interesting to consider how each culture creates gods that reflect its values and fears. The Egyptians, living in a land where the desert was always at the edge of the green, fertile strip along the Nile, understood impermanence. They saw how quickly life could be swallowed by sand, how easily a body could decay in the heat, and so they created elaborate defenses against that decay, mummification, tomb building, spells, and amulets. And they created Anubis, the god who made sure those defenses worked, who stood between the living and the void and said, "You will not be forgotten, you will not be lost." In a way, Anubis is the god of memory. The mummy is a physical memory of the person who once lived. The tomb, with its inscriptions and images, is a collection of memories, of accomplishments, of family, of the life that was lived. And Anubis presides over all of it, making sure that the memory is preserved, that the person's name continues to be spoken, that their story is not erased. The Egyptians believed that to speak the name of the dead was to keep them alive in some small way, and as long as Anubis performed his duties, the dead could never truly die. There are so many layers to the mythology of Anubis, so many stories tucked into the margins of larger tales. There are texts that describe how Anubis fought against Set, the chaos god, protecting the body of Osiris from further desecration. There are spells in the Book of the Dead that call directly on Anubis, asking for his protection, invoking his name as a shield against the dangers of the Duat. There are prayers carved into tomb walls, simple and heartfelt, asking Anubis to watch over the deceased, to guide them safely, to weigh their hearts fairly. One spell, which appears in many versions of the Book of the Dead, is particularly moving. It addresses the heart directly, pleading with it not to testify against the deceased during the weighing. "O my heart of my mother," it begins, "do not stand up as a witness against me. Do not be opposed to me in the tribunal. Do not be hostile to me in the presence of the keeper of the balance." It's a vulnerable moment, this plea to one's own heart, acknowledging that the heart knows everything, every lie told, every unkindness committed, and asking, hoping that it will not betray its owner in the final moment. And Anubis, the keeper of the balance, listens. He watches, he weighs, and he is fair. That fairness is perhaps the most important aspect of his character. In a world where power often meant that the strong could escape consequences, where wealth could buy influence, the Egyptians imagined an afterlife where none of that mattered. In the Hall of Truth, there were no bribes, no favoritism, no loopholes. The scales could not be tricked. The feather of Ma'at was incorruptible, and Anubis, standing beside those scales, ensured that the process remained pure. It's a comforting thought, in a way, that somewhere beyond the reach of corruption and the distortions of power, there is justice, that every life is weighed with care, that goodness is recognized and rewarded. Of course, we live in a world where such justice is not always evident, where the wicked sometimes prosper and the kind sometimes suffer. But the myth of Anubis offers a counterbalance, a story that says, not forever, not in the end. In the end, the scales are balanced. Now, let me ask you this. What quality do you most value in a friend? For me, it has to be reliability. Knowing that someone will show up when they say they will, that their word means something. Anubis was the most reliable of gods. He showed up for every soul, every time, without fail. That kind of constancy is rare and precious. As we move through this story, let's also consider the everyday people of ancient Egypt who lived their lives under the watchful gaze of Anubis. They were farmers and fishermen, scribes and soldiers, mothers and merchants. They went about their daily work, raised their children, celebrated festivals, and worried about the harvest. But always in the background was the awareness of death. Not as a morbid obsession, but as a reality that shaped how they lived. They built their tombs while they were still alive, spent a portion of their income on funerary goods, and made arrangements for their mummification. This wasn't pessimism, it was realism, and perhaps even optimism. They believed that if they prepared well, they would live again, that the life they were living now was only a prelude to an eternity in the field of reeds. And so they worked, and they loved, and they prayed. They left offerings at small shrines dedicated to Anubis, asking for his blessing and his protection when their time came. They told stories about him to their children, ensuring that his name and his deeds were passed down through the generations. In this way, Anubis was not just a distant god in a far-off temple. He was part of the fabric of daily life, woven into the collective consciousness of an entire civilization. Think of a potter in a village on the banks of the Nile, shaping clay vessels that will hold oil and grain. His hands are strong and skilled, and his work will last long enough to be useful, but eventually the vessels will break and new ones will be made. He knows this, but he also knows that the work he does is part of something larger, part of keeping his family fed, part of the community's survival. And when he thinks about his own death, he hopes that his hands, stilled in this world, will work again in the next. He pictures the field of reeds, where he will still be a potter, still creating, but without the aches of age, without the fear of drought or famine. And he trusts that Anubis will guide him there. Or consider a priestess in a temple, chanting the old hymns, moving through rituals that have been performed the same way for 1,000 years. She knows the words in her bones, the rhythm of the prayers, the way the incense smoke curls toward the ceiling. She does not see Anubis' gods rarely manifest in such literal ways, but she feels his presence in the quiet moments, in the certainty that there is order to the world, that even death has meaning. And when someone dies in the temple, when the body is brought to be prepared, she assists in the rituals, speaking the words that invoke Anubis, trusting that he is there, unseen but real, guiding the soul. These people lived thousands of years ago, their names forgotten, their stories lost to time. but they believed in Anubis, and in their belief they found comfort. They faced death not with terror, but with preparation. They honoured their dead not with despair, but with ritual and hope. And in doing so, they built one of the most remarkable civilizations in human history, one that left behind monuments and art and stories that still speak to us today. Anubis's mythology also contains smaller, less famous stories that reveal his character in different lights. There is a tale, recorded in a fragmentary text, where Anubis is described as defeating the traditional enemies of Egypt, symbolically called the Nine Bows. In this role, he is not just a guide or embalmer, but a warrior, a protector of Egypt itself. It's a reminder that death and defense are linked. To protect the living, one must also protect the dead, ensure that the country's ancestors are honored and safe. Anubis, in defending the tombs, defends the nation. There are also depictions of Anubis in what are called the houses of birth, temples dedicated to the divine birth of the pharaoh. His presence in these sacred spaces might seem odd at first. Why would a god of death appear at a celebration of birth? But the Egyptians understood that birth and death are two sides of the same coin. To be born is to begin a journey toward death, and to die is, they hoped, to be reborn in the afterlife. Anubis presides over the transitions, the thresholds, the moments when one state of being gives way to another. In this, he is not morbid, but deeply connected to the cycles of existence. Anubis's iconography is rich and specific, instantly recognizable to anyone familiar with Egyptian art. He is most often shown as a man with the head of a jackal, his ears pointed and alert, his snout elongated. His skin is invariably black, sometimes so dark it appears almost glossy, like polished stone. He wears the traditional Egyptian kilt and sometimes a collar of beads or gold. In his hands he may hold a flail or a staff, symbols of authority. In scenes of the weighing of the heart, he is shown kneeling or standing beside the scales, his hands adjusting the balance with infinite care. When depicted as a full animal, Anubis is shown as a jackal in a recumbent position, lying down with his head raised, watchful. This position, known as the couchant pose, suggests alertness and readiness, a guardian who rests but never sleeps. Many tomb entrances and sarcophagi bore images of Anubis in this form, a silent sentinel promising that the dead within were under his protection. Amulets of Anubis were common throughout Egyptian history, carved from stone, moulded from faience, or cast in bronze. These small objects were powerful symbols, believed to carry the god's protective influence. The dead wore them in their wrappings, the living wore them as jewelry, and priests used them in rituals. To hold an amulet of Anubis was to hold a piece of the divine order, a tangible connection to the god who could see you safely through the unknown. The temples dedicated to Anubis, while not as grand as those of Ra or Amun, were places of quiet reverence. They were often located near necropolises, close to the tombs they protected. Rituals performed in these temples included offerings of food, incense, and libations, water or beer poured out onto the ground as a gift to the gods and the dead. These offerings were not transactional in a crude sense, but rather expressions of respect and reciprocity. The living cared for the dead, and the dead, it was believed, could offer blessings in return, interceding with the gods or providing guidance. Festivals honoring Anubis were solemn but not entirely somber. There was music and chanting, processions through the streets, and the wearing of masks. Some priests would don the full regalia of Anubis, becoming the god in the eyes of the participants, a practice called ritual embodiment. In these moments, the boundary between human and divine blurred, and the presence of Anubis felt real and immediate. As the sun set over Egypt, casting long shadows across the desert, people would look toward the west, where the dead were buried, and think of Anubis. They would imagine him moving through the necropolis, checking the seals on the tombs, ensuring that all was in order. They would picture him in the underworld, leading souls through the darkness, patient and unwavering. And they would feel a sense of peace, knowing that when their time came, he would be there. What would it be like, I wonder, to live in a culture with such a clear and structured vision of the afterlife? We, in the modern world, often avoid talking about death, treating it as a subject best left unexamined. But the Egyptians embraced it, wove it into their art and their stories, built their greatest monuments to honor it. And in doing so, they may have found a kind of freedom from the terror of the unknown, because they had mapped the unknown and named its landmarks, and they knew that Anubis would be their guide. Let me ask you this. If you could bring one item with you into the afterlife, something to comfort or remind you of your life, what would it be? For me, it has to be a book. There's something about having words with you, stories that transcend time. I imagine the ancient Egyptians felt the same way about their tomb inscriptions and their books of the dead words to carry them forward, and Anubis, in his role, was the guardian of those words, making sure they were not forgotten. In the centuries after the fall of the pharaohs, as Egypt became part of the Roman Empire, as Christianity spread, and then Islam, the old gods were officially abandoned. The temples crumbled or were repurposed. The knowledge of how to read hieroglyphs was lost, and with it, much of the detailed understanding of the ancient religion. Anubis, along with Isis, Osiris, Horus, and the rest, faded into the realm of history and legend. But even in silence, even in the darkness of sealed tombs, Anubis endured. The tombs themselves became time capsules, preserving the images and stories for future generations. When the Rosetta Stone was discovered in 1790 and scholars finally began to unlock the language of the ancient Egyptians, Anubis emerged once more. His name was spoken again, his stories read, his images studied. Archaeologists uncovering tombs in the Valley of the Kings and elsewhere found his image painted on walls, his name inscribed in spells, his protective presence woven into the very structure of the burial chambers. And so Anubis returned, not as a living god worshipped in temples, but as a symbol, a piece of cultural heritage, a reminder of a civilization that looked death in the face and found, not terror, but transformation. In museums around the world, statues of Anubis stand in glass cases, jackal heads gazing out at visitors who pause and wonder. What did the Egyptians believe? What did Anubis mean to them? And what might he mean to us? Perhaps Anubis represents the human need for guidance in times of uncertainty. We all face transitions in life, leaving home, starting new jobs, losing loved ones, aging, and ultimately dying. These transitions are thresholds, and thresholds are liminal spaces, neither here nor there. Anubis is the god of those spaces, the one who stands at the doorway and says, "I will walk with you." That's a powerful idea, and it transcends culture and time. We may not believe in the literal existence of a jackal-headed god weighing hearts on golden scales, but we can still appreciate the deeper truth of the story. That we are not alone, that there is order and meaning, that justice exists, even if we cannot always see it. Anubis also reminds us of the importance of honoring the dead. In our fast-paced modern world, death is often handled quickly, efficiently, with a minimum of ritual. Bodies are cremated or buried, and life moves on. But the Egyptians understood that the dead are still connected to the living, that memory is a sacred act, that the rituals we perform are not just for the deceased, but for ourselves. In tending to the dead, we process our grief, we affirm our values, we connect with something larger than ourselves. Anubis, in his careful, methodical work, shows us that taking time, doing things properly, and honoring what has passed is not morbid. It is necessary. There is also a beauty in Anubis's fairness, in the idea that every heart is weighed by the same standard. In a world that often feels unjust, where power and privilege distort outcomes, the myth of Anubis offers a vision of ultimate accountability. No one escapes the scales, no one is above judgment, and no one, no matter how humble, is beneath Anubis's care. Kings and commoners, priests and peasants, all stand in the same line, all wait their turn, all face the same test. There is something deeply equalizing about that, a reminder that in the end, What matters is not what you owned or what title you held, but how you lived, how you treated others, and whether your heart was light or heavy. As we near the end of our journey through the story of Anubis, let us return once more to the desert, to the edge of the Nile where the green fades into gold, where the cemeteries lie beneath the stars. The jackals are out there, even now, moving silently through the sand, their eyes reflecting the moonlight. The ancient Egyptians saw those creatures and imagined a god. They took their fear and transformed it into something sacred, something protective. They looked at death and decided it would not be the end, that there would be a guide, a guardian, a judge who was fair. And for thousands of years that belief sustained them. It gave them the courage to build, to love, to create, knowing that none of it was truly lost. The pyramids still stand, testaments to that belief. The tombs, though many have been robbed or damaged, still hold echoes of prayers and spells. The mummies, some of them perfectly preserved, still wait in museums, silent witnesses to the skill of Anubis's priests. And the stories. The myths of Anubis and Osiris, of Isis and Nephthys, of the weighing of the heart and the field of reeds. Those stories are still told, still studied, still marvelled at. Anubis, the god with the black jackal head, the guardian of the threshold, the weigher of hearts, has walked with millions of souls across the millennia. He has seen empires rise and fall, languages born and forgotten, dynasties come and go. He has stood watch over pharaohs in their golden sarcophagi and over peasants in simple graves. He has been prayed to in grand temples and in quiet whispers beside deathbeds. He has been feared, revered, forgotten, and rediscovered. Through it all, his essential nature has remained unchanged, patient, fair, protective, and ever present at the moment when it matters most. If you were to stand in the darkness of an ancient tomb, surrounded by the hieroglyphs and the painted images, and you let yourself imagine, just for a moment, the world as the Egyptians saw it, you might feel his presence. Not as a literal figure, but as an idea, a reassurance. That death is not the end of the story. That the journey continues. That there is someone waiting to guide you. That your heart will be weighed, and if you lived with kindness, with integrity, with love, you will be found worthy. Before we journey further into the mysteries of Anubis, let us pause for a moment and ask a question that the ancient Egyptians themselves must have contemplated in the earliest days of their civilization. Why the jackal? Of all the creatures that walked the desert, swam in the Nile, or soared through the sky, why did this particular animal become the face of one of Egypt's most important gods? The answer lies not in fear, but in profound observation and a kind of spiritual pragmatism that defined Egyptian thought. The jackals and scholars debate whether these were true jackals, African wild dogs, or a hybrid representation of both, were creatures of the threshold. They lived in that uncertain territory between the cultivated land along the Nile, where humans built their homes and planted their crops, and the vast, unforgiving desert that stretched endlessly to the west. The Egyptians called the desert the Red Land, a place of chaos and danger, while the fertile valley was the Black Land, a place of order and life, and the jackals moved freely between both worlds. These animals were most active during the liminal hours, dawn and dusk, those times when day transforms into night and night bleeds back into day, when the world exists in a state of becoming, neither fully one thing nor another. The Egyptians, who were deeply attuned to symbolism and the significance of transitions, would have noticed this. They would have watched these sleek, black-furred creatures emerge from the desert shadows in the dying light, trotting through the necropolises with their distinctive, alert gait, ears pricked forward, always watchful. And here is where the story becomes more complex, more interesting. Jackals are scavengers. They are drawn to death, to the scent of decay. In the earliest periods of Egyptian history, before the great stone mastabas and pyramids, before the elaborate underground tomb complexes, the dead were buried in shallow graves in the sand. These graves, simple and exposed, were vulnerable. The jackals would come in the night, drawn by instinct, and they would dig. They would uncover the bodies. They would disturb what the living had tried so carefully to protect. This could have led to a simple conclusion that jackals were enemies, desecrators, creatures to be feared and driven away. But the Egyptians, in their wisdom, took a different path. They understood something profound about the nature of protection. Instead of fighting against the jackal's natural inclination, they transformed it. They reasoned, if the jackal is drawn to the realm of the dead, if this creature naturally patrols the boundary between life and death, then perhaps the solution is not to drive the jackal away, but to enlist it, to make it the guardian rather than the threat. This is the principle of fighting like with like, of turning a potential danger into a defender. It is the same logic that might make you hire a skilled thief to design your security system, who better to protect against a threat than someone who understands it intimately. The jackal knew the necropolis. The jackal knew death. The jackal could not be frightened away by darkness or decay, and so, in a stroke of genius, the ancient Egyptians elevated the jackal from scavenger to sacred guardian, from problem to protector. When you see images of Anubis, notice his posture. His ears are always alert, always listening. His head is often tilted slightly, as if catching a sound from far away. This is not the stance of a god who brings death. This is the stance of a god who guards against it. Anubis, in his jackal form, is watching. He is listening. He is making sure that nothing disturbs the dead in his care, that no other scavenger, no tomb robber, no malevolent spirit can harm those under his protection. The black colour of Anubis's fur carries its own layered symbolism. Yes, it echoes the colour of the jackals that roamed the desert margins, but it also represents something more. Black was the colour of the fertile silt that the Nile deposited on its banks each year during the inundation. This black earth was the source of life. From it grew the wheat and barley that fed Egypt, the papyrus that gave them writing, the flax that clothed them. Black was not, to the Egyptians, a colour of death in a final sense. It was the colour of potential, of transformation, of life emerging from apparent destruction. The Nile flooded, seeming to drown the land. But when the waters receded, life burst forth more abundantly than before. Anubis, painted black, embodied this same principle. Death was not an ending, but a transformation, a flooding that would recede to reveal new life in the field of reeds. His black skin told you, I am not here to destroy, I am here to transform, I am here to ensure that death leads to rebirth, that the cycle continues, that nothing is ever truly lost. There is also something deeply comforting, I think, about the choice of the jackal, as opposed to other animals that might have served. The Egyptians could have chosen the lion, majestic and powerful, the apex predator. They could have chosen the crocodile, fearsome and ancient, lurking in the Nile. They could have chosen the vulture or the falcon, birds that soar high above, distant and removed. But they chose the jackal, a creature that walks on the ground, that moves among the graves, that keeps watch through the long night. There is something intimate about that choice, something that suggests Anubis is not a distant, unreachable god, but one who is present, who is nearby, who walks beside you. Let me ask you something. What animal do you most identify with, and why? For me, it has to be the owl. There's something about the quiet watchfulness, the ability to see in the dark, that resonates. I think the Egyptians understood this kind of personal symbolism, this idea that we see ourselves reflected in the creatures around us. And in choosing the jackal for Anubis, they were saying, we need a guardian who understands the darkness, who is not afraid of it, who makes it his home. The jackal's natural behaviour also informed how Anubis was understood. Jackals are not solitary creatures, they live in pairs or small family groups, and they are known for their loyalty to their mates and their young. They are protective, territorial, and they communicate with distinctive calls that echo across the desert. This social nature, This protectiveness translated into Anubis's role as a god who forms relationships with those in his care, who guides them personally, who does not simply process souls in some bureaucratic fashion, but accompanies each one individually through the trials of the Duat. In the earliest depictions, from the first dynasty, Anubis appears as a full jackal, lying in that watchful, couchant position atop tombs and shrines. This image, the jackal at rest but alert, became a standard protective symbol, stamped onto seals, carved into tomb entrances, painted onto coffins. It was a promise: Anubis is here. You are protected. Later, as Egyptian art evolved and became more complex, Anubis took on his hybrid form, the human body with the jackal head, allowing him to perform the elaborate rituals of mummification and judgment with human hands while retaining the watchful, knowing nature of the jackal. This hybrid form is itself significant. In Egyptian thought, the combination of human and animal in a deity represented the union of human reason and order with the raw, instinctive power and knowledge of the natural world. Anubis, with his human body and jackal head, possessed both the wisdom to understand the sacred rituals and the instinctive connection to the realm of death. He could move between worlds, the world of the living with its structures and ceremonies, and the world of the dead with its mysteries and dangers, with equal ease. There is a final layer to consider. The jackal, as a creature of the margins, never fully belonged to either the wild desert or the cultivated fields. It was always between, always transitional. And death, too, is a margin, a threshold, a space between what was and what will be. Anubis, as the jackal god, is the master of this in-between space. He does not belong fully to life or fully to death. He stands at the boundary, 1 foot in each realm, and he helps souls cross from one to the other. He is, in every sense, the god of transitions, of passages, of doorways. So when the Egyptians saw a jackal trotting through a cemetery at twilight, they did not see a threat. They saw a reminder that Anubis was present, that he was doing his work, that the boundaries between life and death were being maintained and guarded. They saw the physical manifestation of a spiritual truth, that death is not abandonment, that even in the darkest places there is a guide, a protector, a presence that watches over those who can no longer watch over themselves. We know Anubis primarily from the dramatic scene of the weighing of the heart, that climactic moment in the Hall of Truth when the fate of the soul hangs in the balance. But to understand Anubis fully, we must go back further, to the beginning of the journey through the Duat, and explore a title that reveals another essential aspect of his nature, Wetwawat, which translates as opener of the ways, or sometimes he who opens the paths. This title, ancient even by Egyptian standards, points to a role that is less celebrated but perhaps even more crucial than his work as the guardian of the scales. Anubis was not simply waiting at the end of the journey to render judgment. He was there at the beginning, standing at the threshold of death itself, ready to guide the newly deceased through the first terrifying moments of transition from life to whatever lay beyond. Imagine the moment of death from the perspective of the ancient Egyptian. You have lived your life along the Nile, in the bright sunlight, surrounded by family and the familiar rhythms of the seasons. You know the taste of bread and beer, the feel of linen against your skin, the sound of children playing and merchants calling in the marketplace. And then, in a moment, whether sudden or slow, expected or shocking, it ends. Your eyes close in this world and open in another, and nothing is familiar. You find yourself in darkness, or perhaps in a strange, distorted landscape where rivers flow backward and the sky seems too close, pressing down. You hear sounds you cannot identify. There are beings moving in the shadows, some indifferent, some potentially hostile. You do not know where to go. You do not know what to do. The texts describe the Duat as a place of gates and guardians, of serpents coiled in the dark, of demons whose names must be spoken correctly or passage will be denied. There are caverns where time moves differently, regions where the unwary can become lost forever, wandering in circles, never reaching the Hall of Truth, never finding peace. This is where Anubis, as the opener of the ways, becomes essential. He appears to the newly dead not as a stern judge, but as a guide, a companion, a psychopomp in the truest sense of the word. The term psychopomp comes from the Greek psyche, meaning soul, and pompos, meaning guide or conductor. It refers to a being whose sacred duty is to escort souls from the realm of the living to the realm of the dead. Every culture has such figures: Hermes in Greek mythology, Valkyries in Norse tradition, various angels and spirits in other faiths. But Anubis may be one of the oldest and most fully realized psychopomps in human religious history. The title Opener of the Ways carries profound implications. It suggests that the paths through the Duat are not always open, that they can be blocked or hidden, and that special knowledge or power is required to navigate them. Anubis possesses this knowledge. He knows the secret routes through the underworld, the passwords that unlock gates, the names that must be spoken to appease guardians. He has walked these paths countless times, guiding millions of souls over thousands of years, and he never tires, never falters, never abandons those in his care. In the pyramid texts, some of the oldest religious writings in human history, dating back to the Old Kingdom, there are references to Anubis as the one who opens the doors of the sky for the deceased king. These texts describe how Anubis takes the hand of the pharaoh and leads him through the celestial realms, introducing him to the other gods, ensuring that he takes his rightful place among the stars. Later, in the coffin texts and the Book of the Dead, these privileges are democratized. Anubis guides not just kings, but all souls, regardless of status. One spell from the Book of the Dead addresses Anubis directly. Homage to you, Anubis, you who are upon your mountain, you who are in the wrappings, Lord of the sacred land, you open the roads for the blessed dead. This is not a request, but an acknowledgement, a statement of trust. The deceased is saying, I know you will open the roads for me. I know you will not let me wander lost. I know you are there. The image of Anubis as a guide, walking beside the soul through the darkness, is deeply moving when you consider it carefully. He does not simply point the way and leave you to manage on your own. He accompanies you. In tomb paintings from the New Kingdom, particularly during the Ramesside period, you can find scenes showing Anubis holding the hand of the deceased, quite literally leading them forward. His body language is protective, his posture that of someone who is both guide and guardian, someone who will not permit any harm to come to those in his care. This guidance was not just physical but also instructional. The soul needed to know things to survive the journey through the Duat. There were spells to be recited, declarations to be made, challenges to be answered. The books of the dead, those collections of spells and instructions buried with the deceased, served as guidebooks, but even with these texts, the journey was perilous for someone undertaking it for the first time. Anubis provided the experiential knowledge, the practical wisdom that comes from having made this journey countless times. Think of it like this. You might have a map of a dangerous mountain range, a guidebook with all the routes marked, warnings about loose rocks and sudden storms. But if you've never climbed mountains before, that book alone might not be enough to keep you safe. What you need is an experienced guide, someone who has climbed these peaks before, who can look at the sky and tell you a storm is coming, who knows which paths are stable and which are deceptive. Anubis was that experienced guide. He had seen every trick and trap of the Duat. He knew where dangers lurked and how to avoid or overcome them. There is also a shamanic quality to Anubis in this role. Shamans, in many cultures, are figures who can move between the world of the living and the world of spirits, who make journeys into the afterlife and return with knowledge. They are mediators, bridge builders between realms. Anubis, as the opener of the ways, serves this shamanic function on a cosmic scale. He is the divine shaman, the one who has mastered the art of crossing boundaries, who can lead others across those same boundaries safely. What ritual in your own life helps you through transitions? For me, it has to be music. When I'm facing change or uncertainty, I create playlists that carry me through, songs that feel like companions on a journey. I think the ancient Egyptians understood this need for companionship during transitions, and Anubis was the ultimate companion, the one who never let you face the unknown alone. The opening that Anubis performs is not just practical but also spiritual. Death is, in many traditions, seen as a kind of closing, the closing of eyes, the closing of breath, the closing of a life. But the Egyptian vision was different. Death was an opening, a threshold moment when new possibilities emerged. The ways that Anubis opened were ways to transformation, to continued existence, to eternal life. He was not opening doors to oblivion, but to a new and potentially glorious phase of existence. This aspect of Anubis, as the initiator, the one who begins the journey, balances beautifully with his later role at the weighing of the heart. He guides you at the start, he walks beside you through the challenges, and then he oversees your final evaluation. He is with you from beginning to end, from the moment of death to the moment of judgment, an unwavering presence. There is something profoundly reassuring about this continuity, this sense that you are not being handed off from one deity to another like a bureaucratic process, but are being personally conducted through the entire experience by a single, devoted guardian. The concept of opening also appears in another crucial ritual associated with Anubis, the opening of the mouth ceremony. This ritual, performed on the mummified body and on statues of the deceased, was designed to restore the senses, to open the mouth so the deceased could speak, breathe, and eat in the afterlife, to open the eyes so they could see, to open the ears so they could hear. Anubis, either directly or through priests wearing jackal masks embodying his presence, presided over this ceremony. Once again, he was opening the body to new life, ensuring that the deceased would not be locked in silent darkness, but would emerge capable of engaging with the world beyond death. In a broader philosophical sense, Anubis, as opener of the ways, represents the Egyptian belief that death is not a dead end but a doorway, that the universe is not closed and final, but open and full of passages. This is an optimistic vision in its way. It suggests that no state is permanent, that transformation is always possible, that there are always paths forward if you know where to look and have someone to guide you. Anubis embodies this openness, this sense of possibility even in the darkest moments. And so, when we think of Anubis, we must think not only of the scales and the feather, the judge who determines worth, but also of the guide who walks beside you in the darkness, who knows your name, who opens doors that would otherwise remain closed, who ensures that your journey through the underworld is not made alone. He is the one who, at the moment when everything familiar falls away and you step into the unknown, takes your hand and says, "I know the way. Come with me, I will not let you be lost." To truly understand Anubis, we must enter the sacred space where his skills were most dramatically demonstrated, where his knowledge transformed the very substance of death into something else. The embalming tent, the place the Egyptians called the Wabat, the house of purification. Here, in this dimly lit chamber filled with the scent of natron and resins, myrrh and cedar oil, the body of the deceased would be transformed from flesh that decays into something eternal. And Anubis was the master of this transformation, the divine inventor of mummification, the patron of every embalmer who ever lifted a sacred instrument. The origin story of mummification is inseparable from the mythology of Anubis and Osiris. When Set murdered Osiris, whether by trapping him in a chest and casting him into the Nile, or by dismembering his body and scattering the pieces across Egypt, he believed he had achieved the ultimate destruction. A body in pieces, hidden in different locations, would never be whole again. The person could never be restored. Death would be final and complete. But Set did not account for Isis, whose love and magic were more powerful than his hatred, and he did not account for Anubis, whose knowledge ran deeper than Set could imagine. When Isis, with the help of her sister Nephthys, had recovered all the pieces of Osiris's body, searching tirelessly through marshes and deserts across the length of Egypt, she brought them to Anubis. And here, the story becomes one of the most profound moments in all of Egyptian mythology. Anubis looked at the dismembered body, at the pieces of the great god who had been king of the living, and he did not see defeat. He saw a problem to be solved, a puzzle to be reassembled, a sacred duty to be fulfilled. Using knowledge that seemed to come from the very structure of the universe itself, some texts suggest it was bestowed upon him by Thoth, the god of wisdom, while others imply it was inherent to his nature as the god of death. Anubis set to work. He began with washing, with purification. Every piece of Osiris's body was cleansed in water from the Nile, the sacred river that gave life to all Egypt. This was not merely physical cleaning, but spiritual purification, the removal not just of dirt, but of the violence that had been done, the chaos that Set had imposed. Then came the careful, patient work of reassembly. Anubis, with hands both human and divinely skilled, brought the pieces together. He anointed each part with oils and unguents, precious substances that carried their own magic: cedar oil from the forests of Lebanon, frankincense from distant Punt, myrrh, whose scent was believed to be pleasing to the gods. He wrapped the body, limb by limb, in linen bandages. These were not ordinary cloth, but specially prepared strips, often inscribed with spells and prayers, sometimes dyed with ochre or painted with protective symbols. Layer upon layer, Anubis wound the fabric, speaking incantations as he worked, binding not just the physical form, but also the spiritual essence, ensuring that Osiris's Ka, his life force, and Ba, his personality, would have a vessel to return to. Between the layers of wrapping, Anubis placed amulets, small objects of immense power. There was the Djed pillar, symbol of stability and the backbone of Osiris himself. There was the Tayet, the knot of Isis, which offered her protection. There were scarabs carved from stone, wadjet eyes, ankhs, and shen rings. Each amulet had a specific purpose, a specific spell associated with it, and their placement on the body was prescribed by ritual and tradition. The internal organs, the lungs, liver, stomach, and intestines, Anubis removed and preserved separately. These he placed in 4 containers called canopic jars, each one protected by a different deity: Imseti for the liver, Hapi for the lungs, Duamutef for the stomach, and Kebezanuef for the intestines. The heart, crucially, he left in place, for the heart was the seat of thought, emotion, and moral judgment, and it would be needed later for the weighing. The process took 70 days, 40 days for the body to dry in natron, and 30 more for the wrapping and rituals. And at the end, what emerged was not a corpse but a mummy, a body preserved for eternity, a dwelling place for the immortal soul. Osiris, who had been murdered and dismembered, was made whole. He could not return to the land of the living, that door had closed, but he could continue to exist, and more than that, he could rule. Anubis's skill had transformed Osiris into the lord of the underworld, the king of the dead, the judge who would sit upon the throne in the hall of truth. This mythological act became the prototype for every mummification performed in Egypt for the next 3,000 years. The embalmers, those priests who took on the sacred duty of preparing the dead, saw themselves as embodying Anubis. They wore masks carved or moulded to resemble his jackal head. They performed the same rituals he had performed on Osiris. They spoke the same words. In a very real sense, when an embalmer worked on a body, it was not simply a human performing a task, it was Anubis himself, working through mortal hands, extending his protection and skill to every person who had died. Think about the profound respect this represents. Mummification was not a grisly or morbid practice, but a sacred art, a technology of immortality. The body was not seen as disposable, as mere flesh to rot away, but as something precious, something worth preserving with the utmost care. And Anubis was the guardian of this sacredness, the guarantor that the work would be done properly, that the deceased would be ready for the journey ahead. Let me ask you, what skill or craft do you find most meditative, most centering? For me, it has to be cooking. There's something about following a recipe, about the careful steps and the transformation of raw ingredients into something nourishing that brings me peace. I imagine the embalmers felt something similar, a sense of sacred focus, knowing that their careful work was ensuring someone's eternal life. And Anubis was there with them, guiding their hands, steadying their nerves, blessing their efforts. The embalming tent itself was a liminal space, a place between life and death. It was usually located at the edge of the inhabited area, close to the necropolis, but not quite part of it, not quite part of the world of the living either. It was Anubis's domain, his workshop, his temple. Priests entered this space with reverence, understanding that they were performing work that was both physical and spiritual, both practical and magical. The substances used in mummification were themselves laden with symbolism and power. Natron, the naturally occurring salt used to dry the body, came from special deposits in the desert, places touched by divine presence. The resins and oils came from far-flung regions, some of them requiring expeditions of months or years to obtain. Using these precious materials was itself an act of devotion, a way of honoring the deceased and acknowledging the importance of their continued existence. There were different qualities of mummification, of course, depending on what a family could afford. The most elaborate process, reserved for royalty and the very wealthy, involved all the steps described above and more: the finest linen, the most expensive resins, elaborate coffins nested inside each other, and tombs hewn from solid rock. But even the simplest mummification, even for the poorest citizen, still involved some level of preservation, some attempt to give the body a chance to endure. Anubis presided over all of it, from the grandest royal embalming to the humblest preparation. In this he was utterly democratic. Every person deserved his care, every body was worthy of preservation. The wrapped mummy, when complete, was a work of art. The ancient Greek word for mummy, which we still use today, comes from the Persian and Arabic mumiyya, meaning bitumen or wax, referring to the dark, resinous appearance of the preserved bodies. But to the Egyptians, the word for a mummy was sa, which also meant noble or dignified. The mummy was the dignified form, the perfected form, the body prepared for eternity. Anubis's role as the lord of the mummy wrappings also extended to the protection of those wrappings and the body within. Spells and curses were inscribed on tomb walls and coffins, invoking Anubis to punish anyone who would disturb the mummy, who would unwrap it to steal the amulets and jewelry often placed within the bandages, who would desecrate what had been made sacred. Anubis will be upon his mountain, he will punish those who violate this tomb, such inscriptions warned. And tomb robbers, despite the lure of gold and precious stones, often feared these curses, believed that Anubis watched and would exact divine retribution. In a deeper sense, mummification was an act of defiance against entropy, against the natural decay of all things. The Egyptians, living in a hot climate where bodies decomposed quickly, had every reason to accept decay as inevitable. But they refused that inevitability. They believed that with proper care, proper ritual, and proper protection from Anubis, the body could last forever. And in many cases, they were right. We have mummies today, thousands of years old, that are still recognizably human, that still carry traces of the people they once were. This is perhaps Anubis's most lasting gift, the idea that death does not have to mean disintegration, that we can be remembered, that physical traces of our existence can endure. Every mummy in every museum, every preserved body lying in undisturbed darkness in tombs beneath the sand is a testament to Anubis's skill, to the sacred technology he invented and the priests who practiced it in his name. And so, when we think of Anubis as the lord of the mummy wrappings, we should think of patience, care, precision, and love. Yes, love, for what is the careful preservation of a body but an act of love for the person who inhabited it. The embalmers, working in the dim light of the wabbit, wrapping layer after layer, speaking prayers with each turn of the bandage, were performing an act of love on behalf of the living for the dead. And Anubis, watching over them, guiding them, was the embodiment of that love, the divine compassion that insists, "You will not be forgotten, you will not decay into nothingness, you will continue." In the layered history of Egyptian mythology, where stories shift and evolve across millennia, where gods rise and fall in prominence like the dynasties of pharaohs, there is a fascinating truth about Anubis that often gets overlooked. He was not always the assistant, the lieutenant, the expert technician working under the authority of Osiris. There was a time, in the earliest periods of Egyptian civilization, when Anubis himself was the supreme lord of the dead, the king of the underworld, the god to whom all prayers for the deceased were addressed. This is a story about change, about how mythologies evolve to reflect the shifting religious and political landscapes of the cultures that create them. It is a story about how a god can be both demoted and elevated simultaneously, losing status in one sense while gaining depth and specialization in another. And it offers us a window into the dynamic, living nature of ancient Egyptian religion, which was never as static or monolithic as we sometimes imagine. Let us go back to the Old Kingdom, to the age of the great pyramid builders, the 3rd through 6th dynasties, roughly 2686 to 281 BCE. This was the era when the pyramids at Saqqara, Giza, and elsewhere were constructed, when the power of the pharaohs was at its height, when Egypt was unified and wealthy. The religious texts from this period, known as the pyramid texts, were inscribed on the walls of royal burial chambers, and they give us our earliest detailed look at Egyptian beliefs about the afterlife. In these texts, Anubis appears again and again in positions of supreme authority. He is called foremost of the Westerners, Kenti Amentu, a title that explicitly marks him as the chief god of the necropolis, of the realm of the dead which lay to the west. He is invoked to protect the pharaoh, to purify him, to ensure his safe passage to the afterlife. There are prayers that address Anubis directly as the ruler of the underworld, the one who controls access to eternal life. Osiris, by contrast, appears in these early texts in a different role. He is present, but he is not yet the dominant figure of the afterlife. He is a god who died and was resurrected, yes, but his kingship over the dead is not yet fully established. The cult of Osiris existed, particularly in the city of Osiris in the Delta, but it had not yet achieved the overwhelming popularity it would gain in later periods. What happened? How did Anubis go from being the king of the dead to being Osiris's assistant and embalmer? The answer lies in the complex interplay of religious centers, political power, and the natural evolution of theological ideas. As Egypt moved from the Old Kingdom into the First Intermediate Period and then the Middle Kingdom, the cult of Osiris began to grow dramatically. Osiris had something that resonated deeply with the Egyptian people. He was a god who had died and come back to existence, who had suffered injustice and triumphed over it, who offered hope not just to kings but to everyone. His story, the murder by Set, the devotion of Isis, the resurrection, the ascension to rule the afterlife, was compelling, emotionally rich, and deeply human despite its divine characters. Osiris also represented order, kingship, and the continuity of life through death. He was associated with the cycles of agriculture, with the Nile flood that died and was reborn each year, with the grain that was buried in the earth and sprouted anew. These associations made him a powerful symbol of resurrection and eternal life. As the cult of Osiris grew, temples dedicated to him were built, festivals in his honor were celebrated, and his mythology spread throughout Egypt. And as his popularity increased, the mythology adjusted to accommodate this powerful new focus. Osiris began to take on roles that had previously belonged to other gods, absorbing their functions, their titles, their authority. This is where we see the transformation of Anubis's role. Rather than simply replacing Anubis or erasing him from the mythology, the Egyptian theologians, and we must assume there were priests and thinkers who worked these things out, who debated and refined the stories, found a way to integrate both gods. They made Anubis the son of Osiris, or more precisely, of Osiris and Nephthys in the most popular version. This familial relationship established a hierarchy while maintaining Anubis's importance. He became the devoted son, the loyal assistant, the expert who carried out the crucial work of mummification and guided souls to his father's hall for judgment. The title Foremost of the Westerners, which had been Anubis's, was transferred to Osiris, but Anubis retained other titles: He who is upon his mountain, referring to the cliffs where tombs were carved; Lord of the Sacred Land, meaning the necropolis; He who is in the place of embalming. These titles reflected a shift from overall authority to specialized expertise. Anubis became the master of the technical and ritual aspects of death, while Osiris took on the role of judge and king. In some ways, this was a demotion, there is no denying that. Anubis went from being the supreme god of death to being a subordinate, even if a highly respected and essential one. But in other ways, it was an enrichment of his character. Instead of being a distant ruler, Anubis became more intimately involved with the process of dying and the journey after death. He became the hands-on guide, the protector, the one who was there at every step. While Osiris sat on his throne in judgment, Anubis was the one who walked through the Duat with you, who prepared your body, who weighed your heart. Let me ask you something. Have you ever taken on a different role in your life that seemed like a step down but actually brought you closer to the work you loved? For me, it has to be stepping away from management to focus more on creative work, less prestige perhaps, but more meaningful engagement. I think Anubis might have understood that trade-off, that exchange of authority for intimacy. This mythological evolution reflects real changes in Egyptian society. The rise of Osiris coincided with the democratization of the afterlife. In the Old Kingdom, the elaborate rituals and the promised afterlife were primarily for the pharaoh, who was himself a god. But by the Middle Kingdom, these promises were being extended to nobles and eventually to anyone who could afford the proper burial and mummification. Osiris, as a god who had died and been resurrected, was the perfect symbol for this democratized afterlife. He showed that anyone could overcome death. Anubis, in his new role, became more accessible as well. He was no longer just the remote lord of the dead, but the personal guide, the protector you could invoke, the god who would be there when you needed him most. This made him, in many ways, more beloved, more personally important to individual Egyptians. People wore amulets of Anubis for protection. They invoked his name in prayers for their deceased loved ones. They trusted him to watch over their tombs and guide their souls. There is also evidence that in different regions of Egypt, different traditions persisted. In some areas, particularly in Middle Egypt, Anubis retained more of his ancient authority longer than in others. Local theologies could be conservative, holding on to older versions of myths while the major religious centers were moving in new directions. This regional variation reminds us that Egyptian religion was not a single, unified system, but a collection of related traditions that coexisted, sometimes in tension, sometimes in harmony. The fascinating thing about this mythological shift is that both versions of Anubis, the ancient lord of the dead and the loyal son of Osiris, coexisted in Egyptian consciousness. The older texts were not destroyed or suppressed when new ideas emerged. The pyramid texts continued to be copied and referenced even as newer compilations like the coffin texts and the Book of the Dead, which reflected the elevated status of Osiris, became more popular. Egyptians seemed comfortable holding multiple versions of a story simultaneously, understanding that divine reality was complex enough to accommodate different perspectives. This speaks to a sophisticated theological understanding that myths are not literal historical accounts, but symbolic narratives that express truths about the nature of reality, death, and the divine. The truth of whether Anubis or Osiris was the supreme lord of the dead was less important than the functions each god served, the comfort and assurance their worship provided. By the time we reach the New Kingdom and the later periods of Egyptian history, Anubis's role was well established. He was the embalmer, the guide, the protector, the weigher of hearts. He worked in concert with Osiris, and their relationship was complementary rather than competitive. Osiris represented the promise of resurrection and eternal kingship, while Anubis represented the practical, personal care that made that resurrection possible. Together, they offered a complete vision of what lay beyond death: careful preparation, safe guidance, just judgment, and eternal life in paradise. What this story teaches us, I think, is that importance is not the same as authority. Anubis may have ceded his throne, but he never lost his essential role. In fact, one could argue that his role became more essential, more crucial, because it was more specific and more intimately connected to the experience of death itself. Every soul needed Anubis's guidance, every body needed his preservation skills, every heart needed his careful weighing. Not every soul interacted directly with Osiris. He was the distant judge, the king on the throne. But everyone encountered Anubis. He was unavoidable, indispensable, the god you could not bypass on your journey to eternity. And perhaps that is the final irony. In being demoted from king to lieutenant, Anubis became more present, more active, more personally significant to the millions of Egyptians who died across 3 millennia. He lost a title but gained intimacy. He surrendered a throne but claimed a place in every heart that ever hoped for life beyond death. The weighing of the heart is perhaps the most iconic scene from all of Egyptian mythology, the image that has captured imaginations across centuries and cultures. Anubis kneeling beside golden scales, carefully balancing the heart of the deceased against a single white feather, while nearby the hybrid creature Ammit waits to devour the unworthy. It is dramatic, it is vivid, and it speaks to something profound in the human psyche, the belief that in the end there must be justice, that our actions have weight, that truth matters. But to truly understand this scene, we must look beyond the surface drama and explore the philosophical sophistication beneath it. The weighing of the heart was not simply ancient Egyptian mythology's version of a final exam or a divine courtroom. It represented a complex understanding of morality, balance, and the nature of a life well lived. And Anubis, as the guardian of the scales, was not a punitive judge eager to condemn, but a verifier of truth, a measurer of balance, an impartial assessor whose role was to reveal what already existed in the heart rather than to impose judgment from without. At the center of this entire process was a concept that has no perfect English translation: ma'at, often translated as truth, justice, order, or balance. Ma'at was all of these and more. It was both a goddess, depicted as a woman wearing an ostrich feather on her head, and a principle, a cosmic force that held the universe together. Ma'at was the opposite of Isfet, which meant chaos, disorder, injustice, and falsehood. To live in Ma'at was to live in alignment with the cosmic order, to speak truth, to act justly, to maintain balance in all things. The ancient Egyptians understood the world as constantly threatened by chaos. The desert encroached on the fertile land, the Nile might fail to flood, bringing famine, foreign enemies might invade. Within society, people might lie, steal, or do violence to one another. All of these were manifestations of Isfet, of chaos breaking through the ordered world. And the highest duty of every person, but especially of the pharaoh who was responsible for maintaining Ma'at for all of Egypt, was to push back against that chaos, to reinforce order, to live truthfully and justly. This is why the heart was weighed against a feather. Specifically, the feather of Ma'at. The heart was believed to be the seat not just of emotion but of thought, conscience, and moral will. It was the part of you that knew what you had done, what you had chosen, how you had lived. Over the course of a lifetime, your heart accumulated the weight of your actions. If you had lived in truth, if you had maintained balance, if you had acted justly, your heart would remain light. But if you had lied, if you had caused harm, if you had created chaos, your heart would grow heavy with those burdens. The feather, impossibly light, represented the ideal, a life so aligned with truth and order that it weighed almost nothing, that floated free of the gravity of wrongdoing. Notice that the heart was not weighed against a stone or a weight, which would suggest a fixed standard of measurement. It was weighed against a feather, something delicate and pure, suggesting that the standard was not about achieving a certain quantity of good deeds, but about maintaining a quality of being, a state of inner equilibrium. This is profoundly different from many other religious systems of judgment. The Egyptians were not primarily concerned with obedience to a set of commandments handed down by a deity. Yes, there were expectations. The negative confessions listed 42 specific transgressions that one should not have committed, but these were expressions of ma'at, not arbitrary rules. The emphasis was on whether you had maintained balance, whether you had lived in harmony with the cosmic order. Think about what this means for moral responsibility. You were not judged primarily by external standards or by whether you had performed the correct rituals, though those were important. You were judged by the state of your own heart, by the weight that your own choices had accumulated within you. In a sense, you judged yourself. The weighing simply revealed what was already true. This is where Anubis's role becomes so crucial and so interesting. He was not imposing judgment, he was measuring truth. He was not deciding whether you were worthy, he was determining what your heart already showed about your worthiness. His job was to ensure the accuracy of the scales, to make certain that the measurement was true and fair, that nothing tipped the balance falsely in either direction. Imagine the care required for such a task. Anubis could not let personal feelings, biases, or external pressures influence the weighing. The scales had to be perfectly calibrated, perfectly balanced, before the heart was placed upon them. The feather had to be genuine, unaltered. The process had to be conducted with absolute precision. One of Anubis's epithets was "he who counts hearts," emphasizing this role as a measurer, a calculator, someone who deals in exactitude rather than emotion. Yet there is also compassion in this role. Anubis was not hoping for hearts to fail, not eager to feed souls to Ammit. He had guided each soul through the Duat, had prepared their body for eternity, had invested time and care in bringing them to this moment. He was invested in their success. His role was to ensure justice, yes, but justice that was fair, that gave every soul the precise assessment they deserved, no more harsh than warranted, but also no more lenient. Let me ask you, what does the concept of balance mean to you in your own life? For me, it has to be the balance between work and rest, between creating and consuming, between giving and receiving. Balance isn't about equality in every moment, but about an overall equilibrium over time. I think the Egyptians understood that kind of long-view balance, that sense that a life should, over its entire span, maintain harmony. The spell from the Book of the Dead that addresses the heart, "O my heart of my mother, do not stand up as a witness against me," is particularly poignant when we consider this psychology of judgment. The deceased is not asking the heart to lie, not requesting that it hide the truth. Instead, there is a recognition that the heart knows everything, every secret act, every hidden motive. The plea is almost a reminder to the heart. Remember the good as well as the bad. Remember the intentions as well as the failures. Do not be heavier than it must be. This suggests an understanding that humans are complex, that we contain both virtue and fault, and that the question is not whether we are perfect, but whether, on balance, we have lived well enough to deserve continuation. The feather of Ma'at was light, but perhaps the heart could be slightly heavier and still pass. The texts are not entirely clear on this point, which itself suggests some flexibility, some room for human imperfection. If the heart balanced perfectly against the feather, or was light enough to pass the test, Anubis would turn to Osiris and announce, the heart of name is found true and just. She has not sinned, has not done evil against any god. Let him here enter into the presence of Osiris, to dwell in the field of reeds. Thoth, with his scribe's palette, would record this judgment in the divine records, and the soul would be granted entrance to paradise. But if the heart was heavy, if it sank down under the weight of lies and injustice, cruelty and chaos, then the consequence was not torture or eternal punishment in the way some religious traditions imagine hell. Instead, it was annihilation. Ammit, the devourer, would consume the heart, and with it the soul itself would cease to exist. This was called the second death, and it was final. There was no recovery from it, no appeal, no resurrection. You simply stopped being. This is perhaps an even more frightening consequence than eternal torture, in its way. Torture implies continued existence, continued consciousness, and therefore the possibility, however remote, of change or escape. But annihilation means total erasure. You would never have existed, never be remembered, never be spoken of again. Your name would be forgotten, your deeds unrecorded, your essence returned to nothing. The Egyptians, for whom memory and name were crucial to continued existence, feared this second death above all else. To be forgotten was the worst fate imaginable. And Anubis, as the guardian of the scales, was the one who determined whether you would be remembered or erased, whether your story would continue or end. Yet even in this frightening consequence, there was a kind of justice. The universe would not be burdened with those who had created chaos, who had lived in profound disharmony with Ma'at. The field of reeds would not be polluted by the presence of the cruel and false. Order would be maintained. And in that maintenance of order, everyone who had lived justly could dwell in peace, confident that they were among others who shared their values, who had proven themselves worthy. Anubis, in this role, was the ultimate guardian not just of individual justice, but of cosmic order. He ensured that Ma'at was upheld, that the afterlife remained a place of truth and balance. He was the threshold guardian in the deepest sense. He stood at the final boundary and made certain that only those who belonged could pass through. This brings us to a final, beautiful aspect of the weighing of the heart. It suggests that the Egyptians believed in a moral universe, a cosmos where truth and justice were not merely abstract ideals, but fundamental principles woven into the fabric of reality. The scales did not lie because they could not lie. They were instruments of cosmic truth, and Anubis was their guardian and operator. In a world that often feels chaotic and unjust, where the wicked sometimes prosper and the good sometimes suffer, this Egyptian vision offers something profound, the assurance that in the end there is reckoning, that truth will be measured accurately, that justice will prevail. Anubis, with his careful hands and his precise scales, embodied this assurance. He was the promise that your life mattered, that your choices had weight and meaning, that you would be seen truly for who you were. And perhaps that is why, thousands of years after the last Egyptian died, believing in the literal truth of the weighing of the heart, the image still resonates. We still long for justice, for truth, for the belief that in the end, what we did and who we were matters. Anubis, the guardian of the scales, speaks to that longing. He stands forever beside those golden scales, patient and precise, ensuring that every heart is weighed fairly, that every life is measured truly, that in the final accounting, justice is done. When we think of Anubis, we often picture him in the abstract, a figure from mythology, a symbol on ancient papyrus, a statue in a museum. But for the ancient Egyptians, Anubis was not abstract at all. He had places in the physical world where his presence was particularly strong, where prayers reached him most directly, where his power manifested most clearly. Understanding these sacred geographies helps us appreciate how real and immediate Anubis was to the people who worshipped him. The primary cult center of Anubis was at a city the Greeks called Cynopolis, meaning dog city, located in Middle Egypt in the 17th nome of Upper Egypt. The Egyptians called this place Hadai or Kasa. And here stood a temple dedicated specifically to Anubis, where priests maintained daily rituals in his honor. These priests were specialists in funerary rites, men who had dedicated their lives to understanding the mysteries of death and the journey beyond. But Anubis was never a god confined to a single location. His presence was needed wherever death occurred, which meant everywhere. Every necropolis in Egypt, and there were hundreds, from the grand royal burial grounds at Thebes and Saqqara to small cemetery plots near provincial villages, was considered to be under his protection. The western desert, where most tombs were located, was his domain. The mountains and cliffs where rock-cut tombs were carved were his sacred mountains, earning him the title, "He who is upon his mountain." Think about what this meant practically for ancient Egyptians. When you visited the tomb of a deceased family member, bringing offerings of bread and beer, flowers and incense, you were entering Anubis's territory. The very act of crossing from the cultivated land into the desert margin was a transition from the realm of the living into a space that belonged to the dead and their guardian. People would have felt this transition physically. The temperature change as you left the shade of palm trees for the harsh sun of the desert, the shift from soft earth to rock and sand, the silence that descended as you moved away from the sounds of daily life. Within this sacred geography, certain locations held special significance. The embalming workshops, those wabbit or houses of purification we discussed earlier, were liminal spaces that existed between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. They were usually located on the edge of the necropolis, close enough to the tombs for convenience, but separated from the inhabited areas by necessity. The process of mummification took 70 days and involved materials with strong odors that the living preferred not to encounter daily. The priests who worked in these embalming houses wore masks representing Anubis when they performed their sacred duties. These masks, carved from wood and painted black with the characteristic pointed ears and long snout of the jackal, were not mere costumes but transformation devices. When a priest put on the mask of Anubis and spoke the prescribed words, he was understood to become, in that moment, an earthly manifestation of the god himself. His hands were Anubis's hands, his voice was Anubis's voice, his skill and knowledge flowed from the god directly. Imagine the profound psychological and spiritual impact of this practice. If you were the family of the deceased, watching your loved one being prepared for eternity, you were not simply observing human technicians performing a technical procedure. You were witnessing Anubis himself, through his earthly representative, caring for your beloved dead. This brought comfort, assurance, and a sense of the sacred that elevated what could have been a grim and frightening process into something holy and hopeful. Beyond the formal cult centers and embalming houses, Anubis was also present in household worship. The religion of ancient Egypt was not confined to temples and performed exclusively by priests. Common people maintained shrines in their homes, small niches or corners where they placed statues or images of the gods they felt particularly connected to. Anubis, especially as a protected deity, was popular in domestic contexts. A small statue of Anubis might be placed near the entrance of a home to guard against malevolent spirits, or in a bedroom to protect during the vulnerable hours of sleep. Those times when the soul might wander and need guidance back to the body. Amulets bearing the image of Anubis were extremely common, worn by both the living and the dead. These small protective objects, carved from stone or moulded from faience, were believed to carry the power of the god they depicted. An Anubis amulet worn around the neck might protect you from harm during life and ensure his guidance after death. They were placed within the wrappings of mummies, positioned over the heart or other vital areas, ensuring that Anubis's protection extended into eternity. What place in your own life feels most sacred to you? For me, it has to be my workspace when I'm deep in a creative project. There's a quality of focus and presence that feels almost religious. I think the ancient Egyptians understood that the sacred isn't confined to official religious buildings, but can manifest anywhere we create space for meaning and connection. Their relationship with Anubis reflected this understanding. He was in the temples, yes, but also in the tombs, the embalming houses, the homes, even in the jewelry worn close to the body. The festival calendar, celebrating the guardian of the dead. Ancient Egypt was a culture of festivals, of communal celebrations that marked the rhythms of the religious year and reinforced the bonds between the people and their gods. While we have more detailed records of festivals dedicated to gods like Osiris, Hathor, or Amun, there is evidence that Anubis too had his appointed times in the sacred calendar when his role and power were specifically celebrated. The festivals of Anubis were likely tied to key moments in the agricultural and funerary cycles. One would imagine celebrations during the period when embalming was traditionally performed, perhaps marking the beginning or end of the 70-day mummification process. These would have been opportunities for embalmers to renew their dedication to their craft, for priests to perform special rituals honoring Anubis, and for the community to acknowledge the importance of proper preparation for death. During festivals, the statue of Anubis would have been carried in procession from his temple, giving people who normally had no access to the inner sanctum a chance to see and honor the god. These processions were major events, accompanied by music, dancing, incense, and offerings. The god, represented by his statue placed in a sacred bark carried on the shoulders of priests, would travel through the community, blessing homes and receiving petitions. People would present questions to the god through oracles. The movement of the bark, interpreted by priests, would provide divine guidance on matters ranging from business decisions to personal relationships to concerns about deceased family members. These festivals served multiple functions beyond simple worship. They reinforced social cohesion, bringing the entire community together in a shared religious experience. They provided entertainment and a break from the routine of daily labor. They educated younger generations about the myths and rituals of their religion through public performance and storytelling. And they created a sense of living in a world where the gods were not distant abstractions, but present powers who could be encountered, appealed to, and celebrated. For families who had recently lost loved ones, festivals honoring Anubis would have been particularly meaningful. Imagine the comfort of participating in a communal celebration of the god who was, at that very moment, guiding your deceased father or mother through the Duat, who had presided over their embalming, who would weigh their heart in the hall of truth. The festival would make these abstract theological concepts tangible and immediate. You could offer flowers or food at the statue of Anubis passing through your street, speaking silent prayers for your loved one's safe passage. The community around you, all participating in the same ritual, would acknowledge and validate your grief and your hope. There is something deeply moving about this communal aspect of ancient Egyptian religion. We often think of death as an isolating experience, something that separates us from the living world and from each other. But in ancient Egypt, death was a communal concern. Everyone would die. Everyone needed Anubis's guidance. Everyone participated in the rituals and festivals that honored him. This created a culture where death was not hidden away or denied, but integrated into the rhythm of life, acknowledged as a transition that everyone would make and that the community would help each member navigate. We have followed the soul through death, through the embalming process, through the journey in the Duat guided by Anubis, through the weighing of the heart, and now we arrive at the destination, the field of reeds called Aaru or Sekhet, Aaru in the ancient Egyptian language. This was the paradise that awaited those who passed the judgment, and understanding what the Egyptians imagined this paradise to be tells us much about what they valued in life. The field of reeds was not a radically different world from Egypt itself. It was Egypt perfected, Egypt as it should be, Egypt without flaw or failing. Imagine the most beautiful day you have ever experienced in the Nile Valley. The sky impossibly blue, the river flowing clear and abundant, the fields green with thriving crops, the air warm but not oppressive, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of flowers and fresh bread. Now imagine that day lasting forever, unchanging and perfect. That was the field of reeds. The landscape was described as containing endless fields of grain, barley, and emmer wheat that grew taller than any earthly crops, that ripened without fail, that required cultivation but yielded abundantly. There were canals and waterways, clear and navigable, teeming with fish. There were groves of date palms and sycamore figs, always in fruit. The sun shone bright, but was never harsh. The Nile flooded at the right time, neither too much nor too little, leaving behind rich black soil that could support any crop. This agricultural imagery reveals what the Egyptians most valued and most feared to lose. Egypt was a civilization built on agriculture, entirely dependent on the annual flood of the Nile and the narrow strip of fertile land along its banks. Beyond that fertile strip was desert, vast, barren, deadly. The contrast between the black land and the red land, between fertility and sterility, between life and death, was the fundamental reality of Egyptian existence. Paradise, then, was a place where the fertility was eternal, where the harvest never failed, where the threat of famine and drought could never intrude. But the field of reeds was not merely a place of passive enjoyment. The blessed dead did not simply lounge in eternal leisure. They were expected to work, to cultivate their allotted fields, to participate in the agricultural cycle. This might seem strange to modern sensibilities. Why would paradise involve labor? But it made perfect sense to the Egyptians. Work, particularly agricultural work, was not seen as a punishment or a burden, but as a fundamental part of a good and meaningful life. To tend crops, to participate in the cycles of planting and harvest, was to engage in ma'at, to maintain order, to fulfill your proper role in the cosmos. However, the Egyptians were practical people, and they devised a solution for those who might not relish the idea of eternal agricultural labor. This is where the shabtis come in, those small mummy-form figurines that were buried in tombs by the hundreds or even thousands. These figurines were magical servants, animated by spells to do the work of the deceased in the afterlife. When the deceased was called upon to perform labor in the field of reeds, to plough the fields, to irrigate the crops, to harvest the grain, they could simply activate their shabtis, who would perform the work on their behalf. The more shabtis you had, the less work you personally needed to do. Wealthy Egyptians equipped their tombs with elaborate sets of shabtis, sometimes one for every day of the year, plus overseer figures to direct them, creating a complete workforce for eternity. In the field of reeds, all those you had loved in life would be present, reunited in a space where there was no separation, no grief, no loss. Your parents who had died when you were young, your children who had died before you, your spouse, your friends, your siblings, all would be there, recognizable and whole. The social bonds of earthly life continued into eternity. You would sit together under a sycamore tree, sharing bread and beer, telling stories, enjoying each other's company as you had done in the best moments of your mortal life. Even your pets might be there. The Egyptians loved animals, and often included depictions of beloved dogs and cats in their tomb decorations. Whether these were literal expectations or symbolic representations is debated by scholars, but either way, they indicate a belief that the emotional bonds between humans and animals were significant enough to be remembered and potentially continued in the afterlife. The gods were present in the field of reeds, though accounts vary on exactly how accessible they were to the blessed dead. Certainly, Osiris ruled there, holding court and maintaining ma'at in his realm, just as the pharaoh did in the earthly Egypt. Ra, the sun god, sailed his bark through the sky of the afterlife, providing light and warmth. And Anubis, having guided you safely to this destination, would still be present, though his role would shift from guide and judge to guardian and protector, ensuring that nothing disturbed the peace of paradise. Let me ask you, what would your personal paradise look like? For me, it would be a place with unlimited books and time to read them, perfect coffee, and the people I love most nearby. I think one of the most beautiful aspects of the Egyptian vision is that it wasn't generic. It was Egypt, the place they knew and loved, just made perfect. Their paradise was rooted in their actual experience of what made life good. One particularly interesting aspect of the field of reeds is its democratic nature, especially as Egyptian religion evolved. In the earliest periods, the Old Kingdom, the afterlife, was largely a privilege reserved for the pharaoh, who was himself a god or at least semi-divine. The pyramid texts, inscribed in royal tombs, described the king's journey to join the other gods in the sky. But by the Middle Kingdom, this privilege had been extended to nobles and officials who could afford elaborate burials. And, eventually, by the New Kingdom, the promise of the afterlife was open to anyone who could afford basic mummification and who could pass the judgment in the Hall of Truth. In the field of reeds, all were equal. The rich and the poor, the powerful and the humble, all received equal plots of land to cultivate. Status from earthly life did not translate directly into advantage in the afterlife. What mattered was not how wealthy or powerful you had been, but how virtuously you had lived, whether your heart was light with truth or heavy with wrongdoing. This represents a remarkably egalitarian spiritual vision for an ancient civilization with stark social hierarchies. The field of reeds was often depicted in tomb paintings and on papyri, showing the deceased engaging in various activities, sailing on canals, harvesting wheat, sitting in the shade with offerings piled before them, adoring the gods. These images served multiple purposes. They were both maps and magical guarantees. By depicting yourself in the field of reeds, you were helping to make that future real, to ensure that you would indeed arrive there. They were also sources of comfort for the living left behind, visual assurance that their loved one had reached the destination, that they were safe and happy in paradise. The story of Anubis does not end with the decline of ancient Egyptian civilization. As Egypt came into contact with other cultures, first the Greeks under the Ptolemaic dynasty, then the Romans who made Egypt a province of their empire, Anubis adapted and evolved, his worship spreading beyond the boundaries of Egypt proper and merging with the religious traditions of the Mediterranean world. When Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 332 BCE, he initiated a period known as the Hellenistic era, during which Greek and Egyptian cultures intermixed and influenced each other profoundly. The Ptolemaic rulers who succeeded Alexander were Greek in origin, but adopted many Egyptian practices, including the worship of Egyptian gods. This cultural fusion produced interesting theological innovations. The Greeks, encountering Anubis, recognized him as a psychopomp, a guide of souls to the underworld, and naturally compared him to their own psychopomp deity, Hermes. Both gods shared key characteristics. They guided the dead, they were associated with transitions and boundaries, they possessed wisdom about realms beyond normal human access. This comparison led to a syncretic deity called Hermanubis, who combined attributes of both Hermes and Anubis. Hermanubis was typically depicted in a fascinating hybrid style. He might have the body of a Greek god with the head of a jackal, or he might appear fully human, but holding the symbols of both deities, the caduceus of Hermes and the was scepter of Anubis. This blended deity was worshipped in Egypt during the Ptolemaic and Roman periods, and his cult spread throughout the Mediterranean, reaching Greece, Rome, and other parts of the empire. The Romans, when they absorbed Egypt into their empire in 30 BCE after the defeat of Cleopatra VII, were fascinated by Egyptian religion, and particularly by the mystery and exoticism of Egyptian funerary practices. Anubis became popular in Rome itself, with temples and shrines dedicated to him appearing in the capital and throughout Italy. Roman citizens, attracted to Egyptian wisdom and eager for spiritual experiences beyond the traditional Roman state religion, participated in mystery cults that featured Egyptian deities. Isis, Osiris, and Anubis were sometimes worshipped together as a family unit in the Roman world, with Anubis taking on aspects of a protecting sun deity. In this context, Anubis might be invoked for protection in life, as well as guidance in death, expanding his role beyond the purely funerary. Roman soldiers, facing the dangers of military campaigns, wore amulets of Anubis for protection. Travelers invoked him to guide them safely through dangerous territories. His role as opener of the ways took on new, literal meanings in these contexts, opening the ways through enemy territory, through foreign lands, through any dangerous passage. The spread of Christianity gradually diminished the worship of the old gods, including Anubis, though the process took centuries. Interestingly, some scholars have noted that certain aspects of Anubis's role and symbolism may have influenced early Christian angelology and the concept of St. Peter as the guardian of the gates of heaven. The idea of a divine figure who weighs souls, who guards thresholds, who guides the dead to their proper destination. These concepts continued even as the specific deity changed. In the medieval Islamic period, after the Arab conquest of Egypt in the 7th century CE, knowledge of the old gods survived primarily in the work of scholars and historians who studied ancient texts and monuments. The great pyramids and temples remained, covered with hieroglyphic inscriptions that no one could read, and Anubis's image appeared on countless reliefs and statues that mystified and intrigued medieval observers. Legends grew around these monuments, often quite different from their original meanings, but keeping alive a sense that ancient Egypt had possessed great wisdom about death and the afterlife. The modern rediscovery of ancient Egypt began with Napoleon's expedition to Egypt in 1798, which included a team of scholars and artists who documented the monuments and artifacts. The decipherment of hieroglyphics by Jean-François Champollion in 1822 unlocked the ability to read ancient Egyptian texts, and suddenly Anubis could speak again through the inscriptions in temples and tombs, through the spells in books of the dead, through the prayers on amulets and statues. In contemporary culture, Anubis has become one of the most recognizable figures from Egyptian mythology, appearing in everything from scholarly works on ancient religion to popular movies, television shows, books, and video games. His distinctive silhouette, the jackal head in profile, the tall ears, the long snout, is instantly identifiable and has become a symbol not just of ancient Egypt, but of death, judgment, and the afterlife more generally. Modern practitioners of various spiritual paths, including Reconstructionist Kemetic religion, Wiccan and neo-pagan traditions, and personal eclectic spirituality, sometimes incorporate Anubis into their practice. They invoke him for protection, for guidance through difficult transitions, for wisdom about death and endings. While these modern practices differ significantly from ancient Egyptian religion, they testify to Anubis's enduring power as a symbol and the continuing human need for the kind of guidance and protection he represents. What aspect of ancient wisdom do you find most relevant to modern life? For me, it has to be the concept of treating transitions as sacred moments deserving attention and ritual. We live in a culture that often rushes through changes without acknowledging them properly. The Egyptian attention to thresholds and transitions, embodied in Anubis, offers a model worth considering. Behind every temple, every ritual, every prayer offered to Anubis stood human beings, the priests and priestesses who dedicated their lives to serving the god of death. Understanding the structure and practices of this priesthood helps us appreciate how the worship of Anubis was maintained across thousands of years and how ordinary Egyptians accessed the protection and guidance he offered. The priesthood in ancient Egypt was highly hierarchical and specialized. At the top of any temple's priestly structure was the first prophet, or high priest, who served as the chief administrator and primary ritual officiant. Below this figure were ranked orders of priests, each with specific duties and levels of access to the sacred spaces of the temple. The organization functioned rather like a bureaucracy with clear lines of authority and responsibility. priests who served Anubis had specialized knowledge and training. Those who worked in the embalming houses needed to master the complex procedures of mummification, not just the physical techniques of removing organs and applying natron, but also the magical spells and rituals that accompanied each step. This knowledge was often passed down within priestly families, fathers teaching sons, creating lineages of expertise that could span generations. The role required not only technical skill but also ritual purity. Priests of Anubis, like all Egyptian priests, underwent regular purification ceremonies. They shaved their entire bodies to remove any hair that might harbor impurity. They washed multiple times each day in sacred pools. They abstained from certain foods and sexual activity during periods when they were actively serving in the temple or performing mummification. They wore special white linen garments, undyed and pure, that were washed after each use. This emphasis on purity was not arbitrary squeamishness, but reflected deep theological principles. To approach the divine, to handle the sacred, to mediate between the living and the dead required a state of physical and spiritual cleanliness. Impurity was associated with chaos, with Isfet, and the priest needed to embody Ma'at, order and purity, to properly serve Anubis and fulfill his duties to the dead. The daily routine of a priest of Anubis would have varied depending on whether he was serving in a temple or working in an embalming house. In the temple, the rhythm followed the pattern common to all Egyptian temples, awakening the god's statue in the morning with hymns, performing ablutions, offering food and drink, clothing the statue, burning incense, and then sealing the shrine until the next day. These daily offerings ensured that the god was properly cared for and maintained his power to help humanity. In the embalming house, the rhythm was different, determined by the 70-day cycle of mummification. When a body arrived, the priest would begin the careful process we have already explored: washing, removing organs, drying the body in natron, wrapping in linen. Throughout this process, specific prayers and spells would be recited at specific moments. The priest wearing the Anubis mask would perform the role of the god, speaking in first person as Anubis, addressing the deceased, promising protection and guidance. This ritual identification with the deity, the practice of wearing the god's mask and speaking as the god, was a profound act of religious devotion and magical power. The priest did not simply represent Anubis in the context of the ritual, he became Anubis. His mortal identity was temporarily subsumed into the divine presence. This belief in the real presence of the god working through the priest gave tremendous power and significance to the rituals performed. The training to become a priest of Anubis began in youth. Boys, and occasionally girls, though female priests of Anubis were less common than in cults of goddesses like Hathor or Isis, would be attached to temples as junior assistants, performing simple tasks and observing the senior priests at work. Over years, they would gradually learn the hymns, prayers, and procedures. They would memorize the spells from the Book of the Dead and other funerary texts. They would practice the physical techniques of embalming under supervision. Only after demonstrating mastery would they be permitted to wear the mask of Anubis and conduct mummification independently. The priesthood was not necessarily a full-time occupation for all participants. Egypt had a system called file service, where priests served in rotation. A priest might serve for 1 month in every 4, spending the rest of his time engaged in other occupations, farming his land, conducting business, living a normal life. Then, when his month of service came, he would undergo purification, enter the temple or embalming house, and dedicate himself entirely to his sacred duties. This system allowed Egypt to maintain elaborate temple services without requiring every priest to abandon secular life permanently. However, some priests, particularly those who rose to high positions or who specialized in complex knowledge like the techniques of mummification, did serve full-time. These individuals lived primarily on temple estates, supported by the temple's economic resources. They formed a distinct social class, educated and respected, possessing specialized knowledge that commanded both reverence and practical value. Women could serve as priestesses of Anubis, though less commonly than as priestesses of female deities. Their roles might include singing hymns, performing music during rituals, offering prayers on behalf of the deceased, and maintaining the temple facilities. There is evidence of female embalmers as well, though again less commonly documented than male practitioners. This should not be taken to mean women were excluded from the spiritual aspects of serving Anubis, but rather reflects the general social structures of ancient Egypt, which, while more egalitarian than many ancient societies, still maintained certain gender-based role distinctions. The economic aspect of the priesthood deserves mention. Temples in Egypt were not just religious institutions, but also major economic centers. They owned vast tracts of agricultural land, employed thousands of workers, operated workshops that produced goods for sale, and controlled significant wealth. The priests managed these economic resources, and income from temple properties supported the priestly staff and funded the elaborate rituals and offerings. Serving as a priest, especially in a high position, could be financially lucrative as well as spiritually meaningful. Families would pay fees to priests of Anubis for conducting proper mummification and burial rites for their loved ones. The cost varied enormously depending on the elaborateness of the treatment desired. Herodotus, the Greek historian who visited Egypt in the 5th century BCE, describes 3 levels of mummification offered: a deluxe version for the wealthy involving all the procedures we have discussed, a middle-grade version with fewer expensive materials, and a basic version for the poor consisting of simple drying and wrapping. The priests of Anubis would explain these options to bereaved families and perform whichever level of service they could afford. This economic reality reminds us that ancient Egyptian religion, for all its spiritual profundity, existed in a real world where people needed to make livings, where resources were finite, where practical considerations shaped how ideals were implemented. The priests of Anubis served the god and the dead with genuine devotion, but they also fed their families and secured their social positions through this service. The two aspects were not contradictory, but interconnected parts of a functioning religious system. The legacy of these priests extends to us through the monuments and texts they created. Every tomb inscription, every Book of the Dead papyrus, every mummy that survives in museums today represents the work of these dedicated individuals who channeled the wisdom of Anubis across millennia. When we read the spells for safe passage through the Duat, we are reading texts that priests recited over actual bodies, prayers offered with genuine faith that they would help the deceased reach paradise. When we see a beautifully wrapped mummy, we are seeing the product of a priest's careful labor, each turn of linen executed with the belief that it contributed to the immortality of the soul within. And so, the priests of Anubis were more than religious functionaries or technicians of death. They were mediators between this world and the next, guardians of ancient wisdom, craftsmen of immortality, and human vessels through which the eternal god of the threshold could touch individual lives at their most vulnerable moment. The transition from life to death, from known to unknown, from time into eternity. And so, as we prepare to leave the world of ancient Egypt and return to our own time, let us carry with us the lessons of Anubis. Let us remember to honor what has passed, to prepare for what comes next, to treat others with fairness, and to face the unknown, not with fear, but with the quiet confidence that comes from knowing we are not alone. Let us remember that every ending is also a beginning, every death a potential rebirth, and every threshold a place where transformation can occur. The black jackal stands eternal at the gate between worlds, his ears alert, his eyes watchful. He has seen it all, and he will see us through. In the silence of the night, in the stillness before sleep, in the space between heartbeats, Anubis waits. And when the time comes, when we each must make that final journey, he will be there, just as he has always been, ready to take our hand and lead us forward into the light. Sleep now, dreamers. Rest easy, For tonight and every night you are under the watchful care of the ancient gods, and the jackal-headed guardian stands at your door, patient and protective, ensuring that your dreams are peaceful and your heart is light. The desert wind whispers his name, the stars shine above the pyramids, and somewhere, in the space between this world and the next, Anubis waits, ready to guide all who need him through the darkness and into the eternal dawn. The story of Anubis is the story of every person who has ever lived and every person who will ever die. It is a story of love and duty, of transformation and justice, of the belief that what we do matters, that who we are is not erased by death but is, in fact, revealed by it. It is a story that asks us to live with integrity, to prepare for the unknown with courage, and to trust that when the moment comes, we will not be alone. The black jackal walks beside us, silent but present, a guardian in the darkness, a guide through the threshold, a god who has never abandoned his duty, who has never failed to weigh a heart with fairness, who has never turned away a soul in need. And so the ancient story comes full circle, as all good stories do. The boy born in secret, abandoned in the wilderness, found and raised by the goddess of magic, grew into the god who would guard and guide the dead for eternity. From the oldest tombs to the latest papyrus, from the reign of the first pharaoh to the fall of the last, Anubis has been there, constant and true. He is the god of endings that are also beginnings, of darkness that leads to light, of death that promises life. He is Anubis, and his story, like the desert itself, is both ancient and eternal, both familiar and endlessly mysterious. So rest now, dear dreamer, and let the story settle around you like the warm sand of Egypt. Let the image of the black jackal comfort you, a reminder that there is order in the universe, that there is justice, that there is care. Let the knowledge of the weighing of the heart remind you that what matters most is not the wealth you accumulate or the power you wield, but the lightness of your heart, the kindness of your actions, the truth of your words. And let the vision of the field of reeds give you hope, a promise that beyond the struggles of this life, there is peace, there is reunion, there is joy. The night deepens, the stars wheel overhead, and in the vast silence of the cosmos, Anubis stands watch. He has always been there, and he always will be, the eternal guardian, the faithful guide, the god who turns death into transformation and fear into trust. Close your eyes now and imagine him, the black jackal, the patient guardian standing at the edge of your dreams, ready to walk with you through whatever comes. And know that you are safe, that you are watched over, that in the great journey of life and death and life again, you are never truly alone. Sleep well, dreamers. The sands of time shift and flow, but some things remain constant. The Nile still flows through Egypt, the pyramids still stand beneath the sun, and Anubis still guards the threshold between worlds. His story is our story, his journey, our journey, his promise, our hope. And in the quiet hours of the night, when the world is still and the veil between waking and dreaming grows thin, we can feel his presence, patient and protective, guiding us toward rest, toward peace, toward the eternal dawn. Tonight and every night may you sleep under the watchful care of the gods of old, wrapped in the wisdom of ages, cradled in the certainty that death is not the end, that love endures, that justice prevails, and that the black jackal stands forever at the gate, ready to lead us home.